morning, everybody.
It's really an honor and a pleasure to be with everyone here in this incredible design terminal at this really stupendous event, Brain Bar Budapest. My wife and I traveled here from Toronto earlier this week and have been really, really excited. It's our first visit here to this city, and to see what's been accomplished and to see this incredible venue, it's really been a highlight of our time. I want to spend about 45 minutes this morning talking to you about this remarkable economic and social and cultural transformation that we are going through here in Budapest, in this region, in Europe, and around the world. I want to talk and lay out sort of give you my general perspective on what's happening, what's really happening in our time, and then talk a little bit about your own city and region that I've had the great privilege of doing some research and reading a lot about. If you think about what's happened over the past decade or so, it's really quite remarkable. If you dial your mind's eye back just a few years to 2007, 2008, and you think about the economic trauma that confronted the world economy, and you think about the crisis of the financial sector in London and New York that then reverberated throughout all the world's economies. And people talk about that and they say, well, that's a great recession, or that's a great crisis. And I think when this history is really written, we'll have a bigger and a broader perspective. And I think it's really why we're all here today. I think what we've really gone through in the past decade or so is if likely the greatest economic and social transformation in modern human history. And that economic and financial crisis really, I think when people look back, signals the decay and decline of the older industrial, vertical, top-down bureaucratic order and the beginnings of the emergence of something new and something quite different. And it's why we're all here today, and it's why we're talking about Budapest, and why we're talking about Brain Bar, and why we're talking about innovation and technology, and why we're talking about the knowledge economy, and why we're talking about creativity, because this really is the greatest economic and social transformation we've gone through. You know, if you go back through all of human history leading up to now, you'll note that for literally all of that time, we generated wealth, we grew our cities, we built our societies by really harnessing physical assets. We settled around great fertile river beds like this great river, the Danube. We developed agricultural societies and trading societies. And then several hundred years ago, we began this incredible shift from an agrarian society to a more modern capitalist or industrial society. It's the shift that the great classical economists like Adam Smith and David Ricardo and Karl Marx wrote about. And you think about the upheaval of that time. You think about the upheaval in this region of the world. That shift from an agrarian society to a modern capitalistic industrial society. We had the rise of all of the various isms, class conflict in factories, two major world wars, several major depressions, but still, the nature of our economy was based on physical assets. Not just agricultural resources anymore, but iron ore and coal and petroleum, raw materials. And we developed these great industrial conurbations at the confluence of major transportation routes, and those deposits of raw materials. The classical economists gave us a theory for this. They said the nature of economic growth turned on three great factors of production: land, labor, and capital. But over the past several decades, we began to see a shift in that older model of economic growth and wealth generation from physical assets. If you go back to the turn of the 20th century, across the entire advanced world, a majority of people worked in agriculture. If you look back to 1950, more than 50% of the workforce in the most advanced countries worked in industry. Less than 10% of us worked in the knowledge sector of the economy. We're members of what I call the creative class. We're scientists, technologists, engineers, researchers, educators, professionals, artists, musicians, entertainers, worked in media, culturally creative people. But all of that began to change about 1975 or 1980. And in a way, you could look back at the 60s, a great time of cultural change, as the beginnings, the signaling of this shift to a new kind of economic and cultural order, which required more freedom, more flexibility, more independence. And by the 1980s and 1990s and 2000s, this new kind of economy begins to flourish. And I'm not the first person to talk about it. Many others before me have grappled with it. People talked about the shift from an industrial to an information age, to a digital or cybernetic world, a post-industrial, post-Fordist future, from a manufacturing to a service economy. Great minds like Fritz Malchip and Peter Drucker talked about the rise of a knowledge economy. And when I began to grapple with this, beginning in the early 1980s and the 1990s and culminating with the book, Rise of the Creative Class, I wanted to look at what was really new and different about our time. And to be quite frank, I went back and I reread Marx very closely. And if you read Marx especially closely, you'll note that he was not just an economist, but a social theorist and a philosopher. And he was very concerned not only with the nature of economic growth, but the essence of humanity. And in his work, he talked about what made the proletariat a universal class, what made the working class a universal class. And he said it was the fact that workers, human beings, we were different than other species because we used our physical labor, our manual labor to transform nature. And we didn't do that as individuals. We did that collectively and intersubjectively by making things together in factories. Thus, workers were not independent, autonomous actors, but part of a collective of social labor that transformed the world by using their physical prowess. Our backs, our brawns, our arms, and our legs. And I began to think what made our time different wasn't just the information we create, not just the technologies we generate, not just the innovations we bring forth, and certainly not the knowledge that is poured in our heads. What made this time different, our time different, was that there was another essential, inextricable quality of human beings, which was social and collective and distinguished us from all other species on Earth. And I went to the library and I picked up a psychology book by a great psychologist named Robert Sternberg. And if you open that book, it says something to the effect, and I'm paraphrasing, if you come across any great musician or artist, entrepreneur, media, entertainment worker, business builder, researcher, engineer, or scientist, you will have essentially found the same kind of person, a creative person. You see, it's not just technology or information or innovation or knowledge that distinguishes our time. There is something much more ineluctably human. You see it in your kids, your nieces and nephews, any little boy and girl on a playground. What makes us human, and it's not just our ability to transform the world with our physical labor. What makes us human and what powers innovation and powers wealth, and which has always done so, is something far more basic and elemental. It's something that each and every one of us share. It's something that's passed down through the generations. It's our human creativity. And that's why I called it the rise of the creative class. This great new class of scientists and engineers, researchers and innovators, media, cultural creatives, artists, musicians, professionals, knowledge workers, that are the propulsive force changing our economy, changing our culture, changing our society, changing the way we look, the way we dress, the way we work, the way we live, the way our cities thrive, grow, prosper, and succeed. If that class was 5% of the workforce in the year 1900, when more than half of us worked on farms, if that class was less than 10% of the workforce in 1950, when more than half of us worked in factories, now across the advanced world, that class amounts to more than a third of the workforce. And in the most advanced economies, in places like Singapore, in some of the Scandinavian and Nordic nations, in roughly 20, Australia and New Zealand, in roughly 20 countries around the world, that class already surpasses 40% of the workforce. Here in Hungary, a third of your workforce, well over 1 million workers, are members of that creative class. And when I look at this class, I talk about the transition to the creative economy being driven by 3 fundamental factors. I call them the 3 T's of economic and social progress. The first T is technology. In order to succeed and prosper, and that's what this conference, that's what Brain Bar is about, you have to be a technology leader. You have to have great universities, great technology-intensive companies. You have to have the ability to generate and utilize, diffuse, and harness technology. Out of the 200 and some nations of the world, this country rates 34th on our technology index. You have to have a second T. I taught for nearly 20 years at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, a fantastic industrial city, which while the time I was there was a technology leader. It had great companies like Westinghouse and companies in chemicals and steels. It had great research and development laboratories. It had Carnegie Mellon University, a leader in robotics and software, but the technology it generated leaked away. And that technology was capitalized upon in places like the San Francisco Bay Area, or in places like Tokyo, Japan, or Seoul, Korea. So technology alone is a necessary but insufficient condition to succeed. You need the second T, talent. You need to be able to harness talent, generate talent, incubate talent, attract and retain talent. I often said in Pittsburgh, the great export of Pittsburgh wasn't steel, it was talented and creative people. This country ranks 33rd in the world, in the top 15% of those 200 countries in its creative class and on our talent index. But in order to succeed, you need to have a third T. And that's the controversial T, tolerance. You need to be an open-minded, free-minded, independent place where both men and women feel comfortable and can succeed, where ethnic and racial minorities can come and feel a part of a whole, where gay and lesbian people can thrive. And trust me, when I develop my indicators of ethnic and racial tolerance, the Bohemian Factor, which showed a place that was open to artists and musicians and people at the cultural fringe, our gay and lesbian index. It caused quite a stir. But what we found is places that did technology, talent, and tolerance thrive. They were the winners. And I would say the one area that Hungary lags somewhat is on our tolerance index. 33rd in talent, 34th in technology, 41st on our tolerance index. All three are important, but together they become the basis of economic growth and development. Well, people hear my theory of the creative class, and sometimes they take a narrow view. And I've had my share of critics. I've had my share of debaters. One fellow said, does Florida really believe that you could build an economy around artists and musicians? Does he really think that what this person called yuppies, sophistos, and gays drive the economy? Does he really believe this creative class, it's not industry, it's this creative group that drives economic growth? Well, let me tell you what I really think. Every single human being is creative. There are a third of us across the advanced world, a third of us in this country, who have the great good fortune to do creative work for a living. But there's 66% of us more that we have to lift up, that we have to harness their creativity. And that's the challenge of our time. Not just to enable and emblazon the creative class, but to lift up the creativity of every single human being. Every single human being is creative. Economic growth and social progress in our time turn on stoking that creative furnace that lies deep within every human being on earth. I didn't learn that from studying musicians or artists. I learned that by studying factories. In my earliest studies of factories all throughout North America, Europe, and Japan, I learned that the most successful factories, particularly the most successful factories in Asia, and especially the leading factories in Japan, were the ones that saw the worker not as someone to be alienated, not as someone to be exploited, not as a cost to be minimized, but saw the factory worker as a source of innovation, knowledge, and economic asset. I went to a steel mill in the outskirts of Nagoya. When I saw that steel mill running continuously in an automated way, revolutionizing the production of steel coils, I asked the plant manager, what great technologist, what great engineer, what great research and development unit perfected that? And he told me I had it all wrong. It wasn't invented in a university laboratory or in a corporate laboratory. It wasn't the product or province of great engineers. It was put together by regular factory workers working in teams on the factory floor. It was the factory, he said, that was a living laboratory. And the person I first heard this from was my father. My dad's name was Louis Florida. He's the son of Italian immigrants to the United States. My grandparents migrated to the United States from southern Italy in the 1890s. My dad took up work in a factory at the age of 13 during the Great Depression to help support his family. My granddad worked in a factory. My grandmother worked in a bakery. My dad and his 6 siblings all had to work, 9 people, to make a single living wage. And when I was a young boy, growing up in New Jersey, I wanted to see where my dad worked. I wanted to see where he got up and went to and drove to every morning. And I would beg my father, Dad, take me to work. Let me see the factory where you work. And he told me, Richard, I work in a factory so you don't have to. It's your job to go to school, to study hard, to get an education, to get ahead. But I would continue to pull at my father's pants leg and continue to beg him, plead with him, please, Dad, take me to see your factory. And on Saturdays when the factory was running overtime, and it was in the great industrial complex of Newark, New Jersey, right across the river from Manhattan. If you ever fly into Newark Airport, you fly right over that factory site. It's a large brick building in the so-called ironbound section of Newark, named because it was bounded by railroad tracks which fed the factories. And we would drive into that factory, that giant brick industrial building. And my dad's factory was called Victory Optical. It made eyeglasses just like these. It made plastic frames from injection. It made metal frames. It plated those metal frames in plating solutions. And it was humming with workers from all over the world, German workers, Hungarian-American workers, Italian-American, Puerto Rican-American, African-American, Polish-American. And I would go in that factory and watch the magnificent machines making those eyeglass frames. My dad would see that I was fascinated by technology, and he tapped me on the shoulder. I must have been 10 or 11 or 12 at the time, and he said, "Richard, it's not the technology that makes this factory great. Lots of people can buy these machines. Some of these are old machines from Italy or from Germany. What makes this factory hum is the knowledge, it's the intelligence, it's the creativity of these very simple people who work here. That's the key. Every single human being is creative. The creative economy turns on harnessing the creative energies of all of us, not just artists and engineers, musicians and media workers, all of us who work the factories. And in this country, 23% of the workforce still works in factories. It turns on harnessing the creative capabilities of those who work in agriculture. And if you look at agriculture, and if you look at food, and you look at modern cuisine and farm to table, you can see this. Our world is adding creativity and value to agriculture. And in this society, 7.5% of your workforce still works in agriculture. And importantly, it means harnessing the creativity of those who are being left behind. The largest class category in our society is not the creative class. It's not the working class. It's certainly not the agricultural class. It's those of us who toil in the service economy, a group I call the service class. And I've been working on this and will issue a report on the service class in the next year. The service class in the advanced nations accounts for as much as 50% as agriculture has shrunk, as manufacturing has shrunk, as the creative class has 35 or 40%. The service class accounts for as much as 50% of the workforce. They're the people who prepare our food in restaurants or in fast food places. They're the people who take care of our children or ailing parents. They're the people who take care of our homes, who take care of us in hotels and restaurants. I could go on. The people who work in retail shops, they make half of what manufacturing workers do on average and less than a third of what those of us who are so lucky to be members of the creative class make. That's where inequality in our society comes from. It isn't hard to understand. It doesn't take a dozen PhDs and economists to understand inequality. Our society's class divided. The old manufacturing class that my father worked in, that elevated the worker, by the time World War II was over, my dad said, as if by magic, his job in that factory was transformed from a crappy, low-wage, shitty job, 9 people to make 1 family wage, to live in a little apartment, as if by magic. His job became a family-supporting good job. He could buy a home and buy a car and put myself and my brother through college. But it wasn't magic. Through the rise of the union movement, through the rise of government intervention in the creation of a welfare state, all of those things that happened in the industrial age and were relevant for that time, we made the manufacturing worker from a poverty job in a satanic mill at less than a subsistence wage. We took those jobs and elevated them to what we thought of as a middle class, and where I come from, they called it an American dream. An American dream, that simple worker could earn enough money to buy his own home. And now we sit here puzzled. As those jobs have bled away, been automated, robotized, moved offshore into the emerging economies, and particularly into Asia and China, we sit here astounded at inequality has risen. It's easy to understand. The creative class is thriving and the service class is declining, and it's up to us to change that. by infusing service jobs in all of the research that we have shows that when service jobs are made more creative, when workers are empowered to know their jobs better, to serve you better, to do better in hotels and restaurant work and retail work, profits go up, productivity goes up, economic growth ensues. So the real task ahead of us here in Budapest and around the world is to creatify all of work, to define the creative class as a truly universal class involving manufacturing, agriculture, service, and creativity, and extend its boundaries. Now, trust me, I could talk for a long time about the dynamics of this economic shift from the old industrial economy, the vertical, bureaucratic, factory-driven economy, to the knowledge-based and the creative age. The greatness of that age and the opportunity of that age is that it unleashes our creativity, it enables diversity, it annihilates the social categories of race, ethnicity, gender. It will not tolerate those categories because every one of us is creative. The places that enable and harness the creativity of the many win, while those that do not fall further behind. And the great challenge is that we have to extend the creative age to overcome inequality and class division to everyone. But there's a second revolution that's perhaps even more important. And I think it's the reason we're all here. When my colleagues and peers talk about the dawn of the information age, the technology age, the internet age, the World Wide Web, they see it not only as a faceless age, as a placeless age. Technology has conquered distance. We are no longer bound by the constraints of geography. In the words of Tom Friedman, the world is flat. Geography and distance, place and community no longer bind us. The world has been flattened out so that we can plug and play, communicate, commute, and work from anywhere. We live in a global world, after all, where we've conquered distance with technology and community no longer matters. In the words of Mike Porter, the Harvard economist, this idea that globalization has annihilated the constraints of community and made the world flat has tripped up a lot of otherwise very smart people. In fact, I would submit to you that instead of flattening the world, the opposite is true. That the rise of knowledge and technology, the rise of an innovation-powered, creative, brain-motivated, talent-harnessing creative age has made community, geography, place, and city not less important, but more important than ever before. And I would say that here we are suffering from the historical aberration of the industrial age. If you look back through all the millennia, you will find that the most advanced societies, our basic advances in technology, in linguistic capability, in arts and culture, have always come from the places where human beings were most densely packed and able to interact socially and collectively with one another. Our great human accomplishment is an individual accomplishment. It is collective human accomplishment that occurs in communities, in scenes, in places, in cities. The industrial age was the aberration. And particularly in my home country, the United States, as a hegemonic power, was able to create a spread out geography with suburbs where city cores could decay and decline. We had an urban crisis where places like Detroit, or my hometown, my wife's hometown of Detroit, my hometown of Newark, could be left to rot because of the industrial affluence of the time. But that was the historical blip. The broader historical trajectory is that human achievement and human accomplishment and economic growth and development and cultural and technological achievement and innovation come from the clustering and concentration of people. we built a data set looking at the satellite images of the world at night. Because the UN doesn't collect these data, collects data on nations. The World Bank doesn't collect these data. The consultancies don't collect these data. I could go on and on. We wanted to understand how the world economy was really organized around cities and communities and regions. And what we found is that the world isn't flat at all. When you look at the world through those pictures of the satellite images, you see great spikes of light, great spikes of innovation, great spikes of economic activity. The world isn't flat, it's spiky. And what we found is the world is really organized not around 200 or so nation states. It's organized around 40 functional economic areas that you can define by looking at the light footprint that we dubbed mega-regions. The Boston, New York, Washington corridor, the area around Greater London, Greater Tokyo, the area around Seoul. It's not China that's the new competitor. It's the economic region from Shanghai to Beijing. It's not India that's a new power. It's a mega-region from Mumbai to Bangalore. The 40 mega-regions of the world house less than 18% of our population, produce 2/3 of our economic output, and 9 in 10 of our innovations. We're sitting in the 25th largest mega-region in the world today. It runs from this city, Budapest, to Vienna. That mega-region alone, not the broader region, accounts for nearly 25 million people and produces more than 200 billion in economic assets. It's a mini country. No, it's not a mini country. It's a large country. And if you take the bigger region that surrounds it, it's 40 or 50 million people. It's an economic cluster. It's an economic, functionally integrated unit that is the unit of the knowledge economy. You see, Marx told us, rightly for his time, that the industrial economy was organized around factories, and that workers who engaged in intersubjective production, who collectively made products, were bound together by their work in a factory. And the nexus of class consciousness, or class struggle, if you like, would emerge in a factory. The economic locus of our time is no longer factories. Factories have largely disappeared. In the United States, less than 5% of the workforce works in a factory. The economic and social locus of our time is our community. It's our city itself. It's the place that brings the 3 T's, technology, talent, and tolerance together. Place and community, city has supplanted the factory as the core economic unit. That's why what we're doing here today, what you're doing here today in this city is so important. We together collectively are stewards of the core social and economic organizing unit of our time. As the city goes, so goes our economy. As this common goes, so goes our society. As this city goes, so does our equity. And that requires an enormous change in thinking, as blinded as we've become by the power of the industrial age and the thinking about the power of the corporation and the factory. It takes a realignment of our minds, of our mind's eye, to see the potency of cities and communities. And I wasn't the first person to figure this out. My mentor, the great Jane Jacobs, a woman who never went to graduate school, didn't achieve a PhD, but wrote some of the most remarkable books, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, The Economy of Cities, Cities and the Wealth of Nations. I met Jane at her home in Toronto when she was well into her 80s. We became friends. And one day I asked her, Jane, what do you think is the most important contribution you've made for your thinking? She said, Richard, that's easy. Most of you economists believe that you figured out where economic growth comes from. You think it comes from companies making a more fine-grained division of labor. Adam Smith's pin factory, the assembly line in the car factory, a factory that makes products in this very elemental assembly line fashion, driving down costs and driving economic progress. She said, that's not where economic growth comes from. That's where cost reduction comes from. If you want to understand where economic and social progress come from, that comes from innovation, from doing something new. And the ability to create something new, to do something new, to create new work does not come from existing companies. It comes from people who band together in these things we call cities. Think about the birth of Apple Computer. Jobs and Wozniak in Silicon Valley finding one another and building a team, and it goes on and on from there. Whether it's creative endeavors like music, the formation of great musical acts and bands, or technological endeavors like startups, they come from communities, this clash and clamor of people finding one another to create something truly new. It's not the mind that's the means of production. It's the minds, the collective brain of a city that powers creative innovation and growth. For the past decade or so, I've tried to probe what are the factors in cities that are important to spurring this kind of creative outburst. I've already told you my 3 T's. You have to be a technology leader. You have to be able to attract and harness talent. You have to be open-minded and tolerant. But at the bottom of those factors is a 4th factor. Sometimes we called it a 4th T, territorial assets. The more basic word for it is quality of place. Not quality of life, quality of place. And if you want to harness and hone that creative edge, it starts with understanding and acting on quality of place. We did a study with the Gallup organization. We surveyed more than 100,000 people. We asked them, what is the truly important thing, not in the economic growth of your community, but in the way you are attached to your community? Oh, and we found that all the conventional things like low crime and good schools, great roads, great transit, they were all important, ethical, modern, forward-looking leadership. But 2 factors predominated. In the minds of people, real people, there were 2 factors that distinguished a great community from a merely good community. One factor was the open-mindedness and flexibility and freedom and independence and tolerance of that community. How good was it a place for women to succeed, for young people as well as older people to succeed, for people from all the classes to succeed, for entrepreneurs to have a go? Was it a place that poor people and disadvantaged people could find a way forward? Women as well as men, disabled people as well as able-bodied, gay, straight. But at the top of the pyramid was this factor we called quality of place. And I think this is an area where this city truly excels. Quality of place. And you can think of this along several dimensions. The first dimension is, what has nature given you? Has nature given you beautiful riverfronts, beautiful mountains, beautiful countrysides? And how do you use them, not destroy them? The historic preservation, the preservation of natural assets, a key factor in how residents and communities perceived this quality of place. What about the built environment, the urban environment, the kinds of buildings you create, the new and modern buildings, and the older buildings one preserves? Well, I read the EU studies of this region. And one of the core advantages in all of those EU studies of the creative and knowledge regions in this part of the world was this incredible combination of natural assets and natural beauties with historical quality of place. The cultural environment, the artistic, musical, cultural environment of a place. How was that utilized? How open was it? How could people relate to it? And not just high culture, not just great symphonies and ballets and operas, which were important, the ability to incubate and inculcate street-level culture, participative culture, quality of place. Key assets in understanding this transition to a community with real soul. And the asset here, I would hasten to say, as navigating this creative age here in Budapest, in this part of the world, it's a core asset. Now, what we're seeing in society today, and it's surprising to many of my peers, is a true urban revolution. For most of the 1950s and 1960s and 1970s, the movement here in the United States, in the United Kingdom, throughout Europe, even in Asia, was from the urban center to the suburbs. But in the past decade, that has reversed. And people say this is because young people want to be in cities and because cities and urban areas are more fun and one doesn't have to drive a car and one can walk and it can be 24 hours. All those things are important. But the real reason is that the creative economy, the harnessing of collective community creativity, requires interaction, requires density, requires clustering. This isn't about just culture and fad, music and fun. High clustering and urbanization are required for economic and social progress. My peers talked about the rise of the high technology district in the suburban areas like the Silicon Valley outside of San Francisco. They talked about engineers and scientists avoiding the clamor and cultural messiness and diversity of cities and retreating to what they called suburban nerdistans. Funny word, a nerdistan, where the nerds can go away from the city. What we've seen in the past 10 years is a movement not just of cultural creatives, not just of artists and musicians, not just of the bohemian quotient. We've seen a massive movement of startups back to cities. The number one location for startup companies in the world today is the urban quarters of San Francisco, not the suburban outposts of Silicon Valley. The fastest rising startup communities in the world are in lower Manhattan in New York City, a place that didn't have a dime of high technology startup investment 2 decades ago. London. But here's your opportunity. New York, London, and San Francisco. The classic superstar cities are not only becoming crowded, they're becoming excessively gentrified. They're becoming the home to the plutocracy, the global 1%. And if you look at housing prices in those places, I'm writing all about this in my next book. If you look at housing prices in those places, only the truly wealthy, increasingly $2,000, $3,000, $4,000, $5,000, on and on dollars per square foot, only the truly wealthy, and even established artists like David Byrne of the Talking Heads and Moby are being pushed out, never mind new and emerging artists. What we are finding is a search for the next places for creatives to find and nestle. And in my research on global startup communities, what do we find? Places like Toronto or Montreal in Canada, places like Austin, Texas, or Seattle in the United States. Even Miami now. Even Miami, Sun in the Fun Miami, beginning to develop an urban startup cluster. Istanbul, Berlin, Sydney, Melbourne, Budapest. There is an opportunity now to take the quality of place assets, take the density and urbanity, take the cultural assets, and create with a mega region of this size and scale the right ingredients, the right kind of urban, creative, innovative, and startup ecosystem. Well, I see by the clock on the floor that my time is running short. And trust me, I'm a professor. I come from the Fidel Castro School of Public Speaking, so I could keep you here all day. I want to end with a story that I hope will at least help you think about and remember some of the themes we've talked about today. The knowledge that creativity is not only coming from individuals, it's coming from all of us. The need to harness that creativity from all of us. The fact that we never know where this creative spark will come from and how it will migrate. And the reason we need strong, culturally creative and urban communities and cities to nurture it. About 20 years ago, I was invited to Seattle, Washington, to help the mayor and the city council think about Seattle's shift from a declining city with a big hole in its downtown core to what it's now become, one of the leading startup and creative centers in the world. And I was visiting the downtown and surveying the downtown, really, which was empty and largely abandoned at the time. Many storefronts boarded up, a lot of homeless people, not much going on, a few art galleries and coffee shops, a couple of bars. And out of the corner of my eye, I saw this big construction site. And that construction site was unlike anything I had ever seen. I've become a little bit more of an architectural buff, but then I wasn't. And I asked, what is that? And they said, well, that's something that an architect, you'll know his name, his name's Frank Gehry. Frank Gehry is building for our community. It's something that one of our wealthy people, young wealthy people, a guy named Paul Allen, is helping us create. And I didn't know who Paul Allen was. Turns out he's the second member of startup of Microsoft, the partner of Bill Gates, a very wealthy man. And I thought to myself, what could this thing be? The first thing I thought, well, this has to be the Seattle Science Center. Paul Allen was the co-founder of Microsoft. He's a software genius, a coder. He would have been motivated, and what he would want to show and emblaze and give back is this idea that science powers economic progress. So it had to be the Seattle Science Center. No, my host told me it certainly wasn't that. Well, I thought, well, he's not a scientist like an Einstein or a Tesla. He is an innovator. He's an inventor. He's more like a Thomas Edison or Henry Ford. He's the guy who puts it together and makes a commercial product. So it has to be the Seattle Center for Invention and Discovery. No. My third guess, I thought, well, this guy's worth several tens of billions of dollars. He owns sports teams. He owns mega yachts. It has to be the Seattle Center for like robber baron, rapacious capitalism, how to get rich. No. What is it? It's the Jimi Hendrix Experience Music Project. The Jimi Hendrix Experience Music Project. When I was a little boy, my dad gave me a guitar, gave my brother a drum set. And I sat in my room, and my brother and I played in the basement. I played Jimi Hendrix song after Jimi, and Cream song, and Led Zeppelin song, and Rolling, and you can go on. But music defined who I was. Little did I know that this great technological innovator, this startup guy, this co-founder of Microsoft, it wasn't Einstein or Edison or Tesla or any of those, or Rockefeller or the robber barons that motivated him. It happened to be a young African-American kid named Jimi Hendrix from his own hometown of Seattle, whose mom committed suicide or drank herself to death, who was raised by his dad, who figured out how to take an old guitar and hook a phonograph pickup to it. And when you think about it, Jimi Hendrix was a remarkable musical innovator. He took rhythm and blues and jazz and distortion and psychedelia and Beatles and Bob Dylan and John Coltrane, and he mashed that all up. But he also was an incredible technological innovator. When asked what instrument he played, he said, I play amplifier. I play amplifier. And the reason he said that, because he realized that the sounds of amplification and distortion and the effects he could add, that he partnered with other technological foot pedals and the like, rotating speakers, echo chambers, and all of this that he invented would change the way music could be made and music could be heard. And when he got enough money, he bought himself a studio that looked just like this room. That instead of having the controls in the back here with a glass wall where engineers could control the sound in the recording booth, he took those controls and put them out where the musicians sitting on sofas and jamming could control and record their own music. He enabled the creativity and put it in the hands of the creators. You never know where that creative spark is going to come from. It's not that software developer begets software developer, or hardware maker begets hardware maker, or internet maven begets internet maven. Creativity is a complex soup which requires openness and diversity, and most of all, requires a community that can accept it, stoke it, and harness it in all of its people, not just its advantaged, but its most disadvantaged. Thanks so much for listening to me, and best of luck in your efforts here in Budapest.